So I don't know if you remember that song from a couple, maybe 5-6 years ago. I can't remember now. But do you remember that song? The second verse went like this. Take a look in the mirror. What do you see? Do you see it clearer, or are you deceived in what you believe? Anybody know what comes next? Not quite, has it? I'm only human. After all, don't put your blame on me. It's a rubbish song, but, the words are interesting, right? Because we think we see clearly. We think we know what it is to be me. We think we know what it is to be human. We don't need anybody to tell us. And a general question there is when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see exactly as you should? Or do we need someone outside us to tell us, well, this is what it means to be human? Because these are the big questions of life, aren't they? What is it that makes us who we are? Why are we like we are? Why do I do the stupid things I do? You've probably all got answers for that. Talk to me later. What can we do about it? What should we do about it? Is there any hope in a world where everything seems to have gone wrong? Well, that's what we're going to look at in this series. We've got, I think it's 5 or 6 sermons in Genesis 1 to 3, and then Kevin's going to finish off for us looking at our passage in Colossians. And those are the questions we're asking. Who are we? Who am I? What does it mean to be a person? Not physically or emotionally only, but spiritually. What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? We're going to get through this and realise 42 is the wrong answer. But that it's far more complex and yet far more simple and beautiful than we've ever imagined. So we're looking at, are we today, at this first section, Genesis 1 to 2, verse 3. And we're going to actually follow the pattern of these chapters, because what Genesis 1 does, through to chapter 2, verse 3, is it gives the big picture, right, of how God created the world. It gives the big, wide-angle view, like when you're on one of those westerns. And it starts off, and you can just see the plains and the prairie, and there's a tiny little thing in the background, and it zooms in then. And you see the carriage or the horses or the cavalry or whatever going along. That's what Genesis does. The big wide-angle view in Genesis 1. And then we're going to narrow in as it does in Genesis 2. It's just we're going to start narrowing in next week in Genesis 1. But, we'll leave that. So here's the big thing. The big things that Moses, who wrote Genesis, I think was wanting to say, what God wants to say through it about this topic of what it is to be human. Here's 2 big things he says in this chapter. The first, he says, behold your God. See God. Look and see the reality of who God is. Right? Because if there's one thing we've learned over the last 15 months, right? I mean, there's lots of things we've learned over the last 15 months, right? But we've learned you cannot predict the future. It's impossible to predict the future. Everything is uncertain. And that's why so many people are worrying, because they're like, I have no certainty in life. And what's important to do when we come to Genesis is to remember the people that Moses was probably writing this book to. He was writing down the history of God's people as they were in the wilderness, having come out of Egypt. As they looked around and saw the reality that they were entirely dependent on God for anything, for food, for water, for getting out of the desert. as they went into Canaan, and the guys there are giants. Moses is writing these chapters, the same as he's writing the rest of it, to a people in a confusing, worrying situation, where they fell out of their depth. And perhaps again, as we come to this topic, perhaps as we just think about life every day, not that you necessarily think about the big questions of life every day, but just everyday life, perhaps as we look around and we wonder how we interact with the skepticism and the apathy and the power, it seems, of those who oppose God and how he says we should live. Perhaps it's quite confusing, perhaps it's quite worrying for us. The mistake to make, though, is to think that that's new, that that's something new to our society. That people are apathetic, that people oppose the Lord, that people are sceptical about what the Lord says, and intolerant of what his people believe. Go read Romans 1-3. If you want to see that writ large in the first century. But the thing is, Moses is pointing us back to who God is and how he created the world, not to give us details particularly so that we can write a science textbook, but so that we can live confidently, so that we can have a rock to stand on. Moses' big thing is, hey, Israel, don't be wusses facing this situation, because your God created the universe. He wants them to see God's power. Look at the very first word and very first verse. Look, and the very first verse is it's like a headline. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, we kind of think, well, what's heaven and what's earth? And is it the sky? And blah, 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 blah. Right? That's not what it means. That phrase has a specific kind of technical meaning. Right? It's really complicated. It means everything. That's all it is there. In the beginning, God created everything that there is. The universe and everything in it. Even if you're a sci-fi fan, the multiverse, if you really want to go there. God created the heaven and the earth. And you see, time and time and time again, it's not that God's wrestling to do that. It's not that he's struggling to do that. Verse 3, God said, let there be light, and there was. Verse 6, God said, let there be sky, essentially, and there was. Let there be seas, verse 9. Let there be lights, moon and the sun, verse 14. Let the waters teem. Verse 20 with the living fish and the birds. Verse 24, animals. God said, God said, God said, and it was. Moses wants to set up the difference between us and everything in creation as created beings, and the God who spoke us into being. And obviously we'll look at this more next week, but do you notice the difference? He created man, people, in his own image. And as we're going to see in chapter 2, he got his hands and face dirty doing it, as he formed man out of the dirt and put his face up and breathed the breath of life into it. This is the God who spoke everything. All those who oppose him, he spoke them into being. And so Moses is saying, look, you can have confidence that he will overcome any obstacles you face. You know, we go through life thinking, oh, life's too hard. I can't do it. I'm not enough. Or maybe we go through life sometimes thinking, can the Lord even do this? is he powerful enough to sort my life out? Whether it's our discipleship, I can't grow, he can't change me. He can't deal with this issue in my life. Whether it's that worry about our job or our family. Whether it's that worry, that guilty feeling. You know, when somebody in the pulpit mentions the words prayer or evangelism or growing in holiness or sacrificing our time. Whether it's just looking at the situation in front of us and realizing, I can't get through this. Whether it's putting away that besetting sin that's wrecking your life. Moses, like here, is like Yul Brynner in Cool Runnings. Right? Do you remember Cool Runnings? I haven't done a Cool Runnings illustration for a bit, so I thought I'd whip it out. Do you remember when they're in the bar and little Junior, he goes up to that East German guy? He's like, you better apologise. And he goes, oh, what? And he's smashing down on the floor. And do you remember the shot? Junior's there on the floor. And this big guy's above him. And all this guy sees is Yul Brynner's feet. And he goes up and he goes up. He says, say something, Jamaica. What does Yul say? 7-foot bloke. Just no problem, man. Smashes him in the face. And a very hilarious bar brawl ensues. But that's what Moses is saying here. We look around and we go, I can't defeat these enemies, this opposition, this life that's crushing me. And God says, no problem, I've got it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's nothing there that he hasn't spoken into being. And therefore, he's in control. His control is so complete that when he had created it, look at chapter 2, verse 2. Chapter 2, verse 1, the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So he's finished everything. And by the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he'd rested from all his work. God's control over the earth is so complete, over the universe is so complete that he can be said to be resting. Not that he's taking his hand off the tiller, but that he made a universe so completely under his command that it doesn't tax God to keep the world spinning. It doesn't tax God to make sure that every little detail of your life proceeds as he has planned it. Moses is saying to us that, look, God reigns. He has written the story. Do you remember what Romans 1 and verse 20 says? Romans 1 and verse 20 says this. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen by being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. That's what Moses is doing here. He's showing how God has created the world, and it says, so when you look around and you see the power of the wind. When you look around and you see yesterday, will it ever stop raining? You see a God who has created all that and who appoints those times and those seasons. It belongs to him. He is in control. He's like an author writing a novel, right? You get an author writing a novel, or whatever his name, that guy Kevin was telling us about, was the best screenwriter in history. Ooh. They sit down and there's nothing there, right? There's only what's in their head. But they create this world and they create these people within it. They give them their characteristics. They give them their strengths and weaknesses. They set the plot out beforehand and they organise everything to work through to that final chapter. Some authors even write the final chapter at the beginning, right? So that everything's working through to it. That's what God has done. And so when we think I need to control everything, when we panic because we've got to be in control, Moses says God's written the story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He reigns over all aspects of his creation, and he pours out his love to us in creating people. Just look again at verses 26 and 27. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God has created a good world for people to enjoy. And he's created people to enjoy that, to rule over it. But ultimately, to enjoy that as we experience the outpouring of his love and overflow to others. Notice there in verse 26, most of you heard it before, but this observation before, but it's the first time God talks in the plural here, right? God is always referred to by Moses in the singular before them, but here he says, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." This is Father, Son, and Spirit creating people to enjoy the outpouring of love that they have enjoyed since eternity. And as they're filled with that love and that goodness, they overflow to the world. Verse 28, God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that rules." You know, God then goes on to give them every food. This was every plant and every tree and everything. This was the only time in history, folks, when vegetarianism was good. After that, it kind of went downhill a bit. But we see God here pour out this love onto Adam and Eve and give them the perfect paradise to enjoy, right? And yeah, we now live in a fallen world, but we so often believe that the good life the Lord calls us to is bad. The sacrifice of overflowing to others with the love we've received is too hard and too bad. Denying self so that others can enjoy God's goodness is bad. But that overflowing to others is part of how we image God. We're going to think about that lots next week. We overflow as we are filled with his love. Look, Moses wants to say to us firstly here, we can overflow, we can have confidence that what God tells us life really is good for us. He has created a world where we can enjoy and glorify him. We might look and see the opposition to living as he has called us to. And we might think it's overwhelming. You know, we live in a fallen world now. We're going to look at that in chapter 3, but we live in a fallen world now where we've faced the enemies of the world and the flesh and the devil. But those enemies, well, they were created by God. Even though it's been bent and changed and broken by the fall, God created the heavens and the earth, everything. He reigns. He's powerful. He's in control. And ultimately we see what it means to live like this, don't we, in the Lord Jesus. He came. He trusted his Father to keep and to vindicate him. He lived in complete obedience and trust of his Father. Even though it drove him onto his face in agony so that he was overwhelmed with sorrow to death, Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours be done," and went to the cross. Jesus trusted his Father that not even death could separate him from the love of God, because God was powerful and in control and loving. And look, if you're not a Christian this morning, this Creator God has made you to be in relationship with him. And if you've rejected that in rebellion and sin, you have broken the entire purpose for being. And you've turned away from the God who's made you. And the reality is that that brings condemnation and hell. But Jesus brings life. Life as it's meant to be. Life where we, secondly, slightly more briefly, live dependent. Because here's the other thing that Moses tells us about how God made us, is that Moses is really clear, right, about God's instructions for how people should live. It's there in verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Moses says we have the authority, God has the authority, because he reigns, because he's the creator, to tell us what life should be. It's like one of those toys. Boys, who's got a toy? Anybody got a toy? Mal, you got a toy at home? It will have, yeah, like that. It will have somewhere on it, on the bottom there, Zeph maybe, it will have the maker's name stamped on it. It will say who made it, not the person, but the company. And God says the whole of creation is like that. And even we as people are like that. We've got the maker's name stamped on us. We're made in the image of God because people are supposed to look at people and see something of who God is. We're made to be dependent. God tells us how to live. We're going to use this phrase a lot over the coming weeks. We were made to be, and it's a phrase I got off a guy called Paul Tripp, we are made to be revelation receivers. We're not made to make up our own opinions and our own thoughts about what life is like. We're supposed to receive the revelation of who we are and what life is from God. And that affects our identity, right? Because why are we created? Verse 26, again, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish and the birds and the animals in the earth. God created, verse 27, mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. We're going to look again massively more next week, but God has made us to be relational like his. Let us make mankind in our image, male and female. He created them. He's created us to rule in his stead over creation. That's there in verse 26, again in verse 28. Vital to who we are as people and how we reflect God, more in the next 2 weeks, is who we are as male and female. Look, in the image of God, verse 27, he created them, male and female, he created them. When God made people, he made them so that the whole of creation, as it were, and the spiritual world as well, could look at people and see a picture of what God is like. An image of God. You know, like when those people say, oh, you look like your dad. That's probably true for a few kids in here, unfortunately. Fortunately, I escaped that. But what does God say to us here? He says, look, you and I don't get to decide what life is. You and I don't get to decide who we are. God does. He's in charge. He's the creator. He's made us, and therefore he says who I am, and who he says I am is who I am. You know, God has worked in creation and through the entirety of the history to put us in the places he has put us and to make us who we are, where you were born, where you grew up, how that influenced you. God decided that. You didn't decide that. Who you are, the family you were born into, the class you are, the ethnicity you are, the gender you are, the personality you are. God did that. He created you to be you. If you don't believe it, here's Paul speaking in Athens in Acts 17 verse 25 and 26. He says this: He, that's God, is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Though he is not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Look, I believe I am blessed to be a Yorkshireman. Far blessed, more blessed than any of you who aren't, right? That may or may not be true. But you insert any identity in there. You can insert your gender or your ethnicity or your music taste or your whatever. But that identity is not the most important thing about you. It's part of who you are. It's not the most important thing. Ultimately, you are made in the image of God. That is true of everyone. You are made to reflect God. As we're going to see with Kevin and throughout this series, ultimately, the most important identity for a Christian is who we are in Jesus. Because we need Jesus. Because the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned and our continual living as sinners after that, has broken that image. He smashed it. It's like somebody, you're looking in that mirror and you don't see clearly because someone's taken a hammer to it. We now say, look, I have authority to decide who I am. I have authority to live independent of anyone else. Here's a silly example. Take a man and give him a flat pack from IKEA. And he'll get everything out. But I'll tell you one thing, he probably, it's probably not true of everyone, one thing he probably won't get out is the instructions. Right? And he might make a good job of putting it together. It might seem a good approximation of what it looks like on a picture. But you're always left with a few screws over or a few screws left. There's always something that's not quite right. God has given us the instructions how to live. It's in this book. We don't want to live like that. As we'll see in a few weeks, the fall has affected every part of us. Physically, we're broken. Adam and Eve must have been, right, proper good looking, right? Because there's some good looking people about, maybe even some in this room. And we're all broken by the fall. Physically, mentally, our brains don't work properly. I don't need to convince many of us of that. Here. Spiritually, we're bent and broken and turned in on ourselves emotionally. We can't deal with life. We're screwed up and impossible to untangle. You know, before, like AirPods and their fake things are like the best things ever. Do you remember what it's like to get headphones out and have to spend 15 minutes untangling your headphones? That's what the fall has done to us. It's screwed us up, untangled us and broken us so we don't work properly. And that's made worse by the fact that we get even more screwed up by interacting with other screwed up people all the time. So all kind of different levels. And vice versa. Ultimately, though, the fall means that we don't want to reflect God. We don't want to glorify and enjoy Him. We want to glorify and enjoy ourselves. We therefore make God in our image rather than us being made in His. I want a God who will give me what I want and do a little cheeky wink when I sin. That's why we need Jesus, right? Because Jesus didn't live like that. He was the ultimate dependent man. He was willingly submitting to his Father in obedience even to death. He was, as we read in the beginning in Hebrews, the exact representation of the Father's being. He was the image of the invisible God, Colossians 1:15. You want to know what it means to live as a human. You want to know what it means to live out the image of God. Look at Jesus. And if you say, well, I'm a woman, that's a bit hard. I'll point you, ladies, to a passage that's all about Jesus that you all love. It's called Proverbs 31. Right? The ultimate woman. What does it look like to follow Jesus as the ultimate woman? Look at Proverbs 31. Look at how God talks about as a hen. He wants to gather his people as a hen shepherds her chicks. That's a female metaphor, not because necessarily human women are better at caring and her. A hen is female, full stop, right? It's in Jesus we can enjoy this life as it's meant to be. In relationship with the Father, enjoying him forever, ruling over his creation, subduing it, living in relationship with one another as we love others, overflowing out of the love God gives us in Jesus. The first Adam, this Adam, failed. We'll see in a few weeks, won't we? He was given an instruction, don't eat that fruit, have this whole paradise, and don't eat that one thing. He says, nah, I fancy that, thanks. But a second Adam, Paul tells us in Romans, a new, a better first man, Jesus, came and obeyed fully and went to a different tree so that we can taste the fruit of life in him. He was nailed there in our place. God is building a new humanity in the second Adam. When we're broken down by the difficulties of living in a fallen world, that's good news, right? This perfect relationship with God, ruling over the creation and subdue it, is the hope we have in Jesus. We will be truly, fully human. We can start to experience that now as we live in relationship with God and with others. And therefore, as we're going to see over the next few weeks, if we are a new creation in Christ, then we need to live like it. This dependent life as revelation receivers, living to reflect our glorious Saviour Jesus. A life that shines out to the world around them and gives them a vision of what it means to live life as it was meant to be. Let's pray.